The Luncheon Society has been around. This is the 26th season of the Luncheon Society. Began in 1996 on kind of a dare or a bar bet or whatever you want to call it. We tracked somebody down we thought was interesting. We couldn't understand why a former lefty fringe presidential candidate from the 1970s became an investment banker, and he lived in the Bay Area. So we thought we'd take him out to the Hotel Durant, which is in Berkeley. We had a smashing gathering, and that's where it started. I think we've done something to the tune of 350 lunches later. Started out in San Francisco, expanded to Los Angeles because love movies, and that speaks for itself. Then of course we had to go to New York. Then we expanded kind of furtively into Boston. It kind of came, and we were up in Cambridge at Toscano, if memory serves, which is still a great little place. And then the pandemic hit. And so what we decided to do, in fact, our first practice Luncheon Society online was with Joyce Carol Oates. And it was a great deal of fun. And we decided to expand it outward, and we have done that. And again, there's no rhyme or reason to what we do here. It's been going on kind of like a self-moving machine. The lunches themselves are all over the place on purpose. They tend to be rather eclectic. What's coming up? 2 weeks from now, on the 23rd, Lisa Napoli is a friend. She's got a great book. It's coming out in a week, I think. It's called, I've got it right here. I'm reading it. It's Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki. It's a story of the founding mothers of NPR. And what's going to be great is that we're going to have a number of family members will be joining us, which actually adds to the gist of the conversation. It's kind of the straw that stirs the drink. And then after that, we have an old friend of ours who's been a member of the Luncheon Society, who's running for mayor of New York, and so she'll join us. And excuse me.
Who's that?
She's a Rockefeller Republican. It's Sarah Turchwell. She's an old pal. She's great, and she's kind of a liberal Republican of the kind of the Bill Green, Rockefeller focus, and she can you can. Who knows what's going to happen this year with ranked choice voting? Obviously, Democrats outnumber Republicans 8 or 9 to 1, but stranger things have happened in the world of mayoral politics. And certainly, it could be a big step to somewhere very interesting for her down the road. And then Alan Zweibel has joined us on a number of occasions. He's a great humor writer. We've got a variety of other people that we're just going to, that we do. And if you have a chance, just wander through the kind of the Luncheon Society archives that are somewhat under construction, and you can get a hunch of what we've done, and folks tend to come back. So shall we jump into things?
Yeah.
Yay. Well, welcome to, I think this is the 5th or 6th Luncheon Society this year. And Liz and I have been talking about this, and those who write memoirs are courageous people by design, because it's something because when you write a memoir, there is a certain peril to it, and there's a pleasure to it, and then you tell your story, you may be overturning rocks that are very difficult for some in the family dynamic to really grasp or understand. But I think these are, I think though the courage of truth telling speaks for itself. And that's why, when I read these books, I was knocked out by it. I may have read when the Bishop's article was not serialized, but it was the original New Yorker article, and I was just knocked out. And when I read the book, I was blown away. And to tell as I said in the invitation, what do you do when you have when your father has a secret, your father has been well respected nationally as a secret, well, you write about it.
Okay.
And I'm going to put everybody on mute here too. Put yourself on mute if you could. That's my fault here. And what do you do when you discover your late mother's treasure trove of writings? Well, you write about it. You write about it honestly. And I think that brings to the table a level of courageousness that I aspire to. And with that, I'm excited to have Honor. And I'm also excited to have Liz Benedict here. My job will be different this time. My job will be more of a secondary moderator, because Elizabeth, this will be a conversation in certain respects between Elizabeth and Honor, which will be joining in. So Honor will be doing a couple of readings. Elizabeth will be asking a couple of questions. And once we're done with that, we're going to go back to the traditional focus where we all put our name in the queue, and I'll walk you through that. You'll see the chat function below. Put your name in there. And once we get beyond that first round of questions between Elizabeth and Honor, then we'll go to the questions from the audience. So are we ready? Welcome, Honor. It's a pleasure for you to be here. I'm excited. Let's jump into this.
Hi, guys. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with Honor. It's an honor to be here. And it's great to see all of you on the little screen and maybe someday in real life again. And thank you to Bob and the Luncheon Society for inviting us and for doing all the technical work to make this happen, and for all the lunches that have made this one possible. And one of the things that's so much fun about this is that we really can talk to each other across the table or through the screen. Honor Moore is the author of the two memoirs we're going to talk about today, The Bishop's Daughter, which came out in 2008, and Our Revolution, which came out a year ago, and which just came out in paperback. Honor has the dubious distinction of having 3 books published during the pandemic. Before her 2 memoirs, she wrote a biography which had a lot of personal elements to it, called The White Blackbird, about her grandmother, the painter Margaret Sanger, who's a distant cousin. Who's a distant cousin of John Singer Sargent. And Honor is also the author of 4 books of poetry and a Broadway play. In the material that we sent you with Honor's biography, we didn't include her very significant body of work as an editor of many volumes of poetry, prose, and theater, including the just published, really landmark volume with Alex Kate Schulman called Women's Liberation, Feminist Writings That Inspired a Revolution and Still Can, which I just want to hold up because it's very kind of wonderful and important. And it just came out. And I mention the other work both to encourage you to seek it out, but also because Honor's interest in history that we see in these volumes, literary history, social and cultural history, is also much in evidence in the 2 memoirs we're going to talk about. The memoirs are much more than fascinating family stories, but also stories about families who played many roles in American history. At the center of both memoirs is the story of a parent and the story of a daughter investigating the parent's life, the family's life, and her own relationship with these complicated, larger than life people, and people whose secrets from each other, from the family and the public, came at great cost to everyone. I have a few questions about both content and writer issues, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. Honor, dear, a lot of your work as a writer and editor is about the women's movement. And you and I had a few conversations on a park bench on Riverside Drive with our masks on between our buildings in New York. And in one of them, you said, not quoting you directly, something like, if it weren't for the women's movement, my life would have been dramatically different. And I said, oh, you mean you'd have lived in a house with a picket fence in the suburbs? And you said, no, I wouldn't have found my voice. In 1968, in a poem about the artist Katha Kollowitz, Muriel Rukeyser wrote a line that's become very famous. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. So let's pause to remember that was 50 years ago. And there have been a lot of women telling their stories since then. And so this is a two-part question, Honor. And if you get to the end of part one and you forget, I'll repeat the second part, okay?
Okay.
I want you to talk a little bit about the whole question of women and silence and women telling their stories, and what was Muriel Rukeyser talking about in 1968? And what does it mean? What has it meant for so many women to have found their voices and to be telling their stories in these 50 years? I guess, what has it meant to you? Kind of what you think about. And then I guess I want to just ask you, second part, what did these things mean to you writing the books you've written?
Okay. I want to say these books are not about the women's movement. My books are sort of the women's movement. I think of my writing as as my activism in a sense, insofar as, because for me, it really was as dramatic as the Rukeyser poem. The world that split open was the world of my own experience, which before the women's movement, I had no method of exploring, even in psychotherapy with a sequence of male therapists. But it was thinking about myself as a woman and putting myself at the center of my own story, which is, not so easy as it sounds in a sentence like that. But it's like, it was kind of like a thunderclap. Oh my goodness, I have a life. And of course, there were various modes through which that happened. Consciousness raising groups, in which I was into a different kind of therapy. And women's friendships opened up so that we began to be kind of comrades in a struggle, as opposed to mere rivals for the piece of the pie, the tiny piece of the pie that was ours. And so really my memoir work, which started really with the book about my grandmother. I could not fit her into a poem, is what I say. And I know that's a little coy, but it's true. I kept trying to write a poem about her. And then Janet Sternberg said she was invited me to be part of an anthology she was editing called The Writer on Her Work, Women Writers on Their Life and Situation. And she said, you could write about someone who's influenced you. And this grandmother had influenced me because she had been silenced. She stopped painting in her early 40s, just at the brink of success. And and I wanted to know why, because I didn't feel like being silenced. Every time I finished a poem, I would feel as if I was silenced, but then I'd write another one. And I'd give readings at places like the Women's Building in Los Angeles, and Chrissy Schlesinger, who's here, was at some of those readings. And, I was part of a community and part of a movement and part of a group. I had a lot of support for what I was doing, but my work wasn't really about that. My work was really because of that. And the idea of telling the truth about my life was just what we did, because the idea was, how can we know about our lives as women unless we tell the truth? The crisis of this came with the book about when I discovered that my father had led a secret life as a bisexual man for his entire life. And I was like, what? I actually, Liz, should I read that little part now? Because it's really it's about what happened to me.
Yeah, sure. But can I just kind of set it up slightly about the writing part, or do you want to just?
Why don't I read first? Okay. And then
sure.
This is this is a description of what happened to me after the phone call in which my father called me up and he said, it's come out that I've had gay affairs. And he also said, you are not going to write a short story about it. And it was like, I don't write fiction, so don't worry.
Don't worry, Dad.
Jet lag gave me an excuse to spend that day in bed and the next. Lying there, my father's contradictions came crashing in, blurring any clarity I'd had about our family past. I knew I wanted to protect him, so I confided in only one close friend. I remember telling her it was as if the light, which had been pink, was now green. I meant the ambient light through which I saw the world. Pink and green. If you wore pink and green on Thursdays at Shortridge High School in Indianapolis, you were definitely queer. How impossibly sad and painful to live a whole life torn in two, to move forward as husband and father while kept from another kind of desire. And as a priest, every angry feeling, oh, wait a second here, I'm sorry, hang on. Every angry feeling I'd ever had toward my father dissolved. But then as I considered what he'd withheld in our so-called intimate conversations, a new anger rose up. My father, a liar. My father, the priest, a liar. And then I saw his guilt, his weeping when my mother died, how he said of Brenda, my stepmother, she's very hurt, it's pretty rough. And I thought of Brenda's adoring love of him, her nicknames, her eyes sparkling, how she looked after him. And the conversation with Betty came back, and with it, a friend of my mother's who told me that my mother believed that my father was a gay man. And the conversation with Betty came back, and with it, in spite of my effort to hold it off, anger on behalf of my mother. And he blamed her for the difficulties in their intimacy. I thought of her in Payne Whitney, of her admission at the Roma restaurant over lunch, of her struggles to be honest and kind during this separation. He blamed her. In telephone calls with my sisters and brothers, I gathered new information that continued to shatter the emotional chronology I had so painstakingly constructed in the years since my mother's announcement in the Adirondacks, I'm having trouble with my marriage. I watched the light play on the ceiling, turn to sleep, to waking, unable to believe what I now knew, that my mother had known my father's secret when I walked toward her in the Adirondacks. I am having some problems with my marriage, is what she actually said. That in the painful years she spent separating from my father, she never confronted him or betrayed his secret to us, in spite of the agony it must have caused her. And I remembered her cheeks wet with tears, her rage that women might want to be Episcopal priest. How, nearly spitting in anger at my father, she had shouted, "The church is just second rate," pounding the dining room table.
Whew. So the whole structure for all the questions I set up has just
Collapsed.
shattered.
So sorry.
But that's great. No, it's great. It's fine. But so, Honor, since there are a lot of people writing memoir and writers here who probably want to know what it was like to write that, and how, and also a question that I'm often asked as a teacher is, how do you write about intense emotion without resorting to cliches? And of course, all writing is about not resorting to cliches, but especially when you have this very, very intense emotion, it's so easy to say, my heart was broken in. Sorry. Hello.
Well,
sort of in general, how do you do that? But how did you do that here? Or what were you aware of?
I can tell you. Two things. One is that I had been thinking about my relationship with my father and going to therapy and beating my brains out about it for about, however many years it had been, 25 years since my mother's death. So I really knew the terrain. The second is, and this speaks to your technical question, I have a background in the theater. So I am used to voices coming from different places.
Okay.
And so, and also that operated in my poems. So I hear things. So I remembered lying in bed with the pink and the green on the ceiling. And then I just allowed the memories in and worked with the dramatization of it, the dramaturgy of it. And it really had to do with hearing and visualizing and allowing myself to feel again. And, I happen to be someone who thinks that it's much easier to write out of intense feeling than to write out of less intense feeling. And in fact, the issue of beginning our revolution was that while my father had been dead a year when I started that book, my mother had been dead 40 years when I started this book. How was I going to find the emotional connection, and what was the emotional chronology going to be? Because I think that while I'm actually, I believe in chronology, but more importantly in a memoir is a kind of underpinned emotional chronology that you have to be true to. And it's almost as if I went forward with the emotion and then recruited scenes and things. And with The Bishop's Daughter, writing that book was a kind of ecstatic experience because everything was right there in my head, because he died and we'd had this powerful kind of reconciliation at the very end, the very last minute. But with my mother, I had to kind of churn up a new knowledge of her through remembering, through reading her writing that I was left by her in her will. And, it took quite a few years to kind of churn up the feeling and to encounter her, not so much as my mother. Very quickly it became that she was this other woman. And also she died at 50 and I was in my late 60s when I started this book. And so she could have been my daughter. So there was also that. Plus she was writing and I had all her, juvenilia and college writing. So in a way, and I teach writing. So in a way, she also became my writing student. So it was sort of, I'm organizing her writing and I'm churning up this feeling and I'm, dramatizing it. I think that would be that if I have a secret, that's it. That's what the secret is.
So dramatizing, meaning that you're creating scenes around which or in which these emotions take place. Is that kind of
Not
another way of saying
necessarily
it?
just scenes. I'm talking about dramatizing on the surface of the page. So I could be writing a scene and then from left field, there's a point in our revolution when, they correspond, their courtship was carried on by correspondence. It's 2,000 pages of handwritten letters, which
This is your parents.
My parents, yeah. And at a certain point, I just added something that said, I've been trying to get my parents married for 2 months. And that was in the writing time. And so it's not just dramatizing what's in the story, it's also dramatizing sort of the act of writing, the act of memory, conversations. I'm not a mother, so I would, whenever I came to a point about motherhood, I would, call up one of my mother friends or mother sisters and I'd say, what was it like? And then instead of thinking that I could say what it was like, I'd put in the conversation.
Okay,
because
so that's
because I always want things moving. I want the reader to be like engaged in the whole thing.
okay. So that's really interesting. And if I just want to talk about what that was like when I read Our Revolution. You do interject yourself a lot and say, Well, I'm not really sure if you don't exactly say this. I'm not exactly sure what to say here, but this is what I'm thinking about. I mean, you're kind of sharing with the reader things about the process of writing and about the difficulties of it because of the overwhelming nature of the material, right? I mean, is that sort of
Well,
or
not just,
no?
not really,
Or
not
is that
not the overwhelming in the sense of the amount of it, not the
yeah,
overwhelming.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, but
just
the amount
you
of it
know,
and
the
and
amount of
also
it, and of wanting how to tell the story. For
mhm,
instance, my mother spent time in Payne Whitney toward the end of her life, and it was really, we had sort of, my father had sort of encouraged this idea that she was uh, crazy, and so we, sort of mourned a mother who was, thwarted and sick with cancer and almost died in an automobile accident, was in a mental hospital. And that's not a great story, and
mhm,
I always thought, well, that's not exactly how I remember things. But of course, I felt like I was crazy. And when the truth was that she actually wrote a narrative about being in Payne Whitney that she wrote in the third person. So it's very interesting. I put everything in her voice. In the another part of the dramaturgy on the page is that I put everything in the book that's in her voice in italics. So I could have like 2 words or a sentence or a paragraph, or I could have, in the case of the mental hospital sequence, I think it's 5 pages or something.
mhm.
And it's in the third person. And I wrote about her in the third person. So there's a way in which we connect there. And I just let her have the narrative reins
Mhm.
for that period. Now, I was at Martha's Vineyard at the time, and I called up this poet friend, Michael Palmer, who's sort of, uh, very, very, sort of very knowledgeable about the French, whatever, about mental illness. And I was talking about R.D. Laing, and he was leaving the next day. And I said, am I crazy? And then I ran through this R.D. Laing idea that madness is not necessarily madness, and that one worked through things that way. And she wasn't actually mad. She needed a refuge, was what I concluded. But I would just find people. I mean, he's actually not in the book, but he might have been. That conversation might have been. I didn't need it. But
Mhm.
uh, I was always trying technically, in the sense of the technique of narrative, to get the story to move forward in my voice, and with some remarks by her. And
Mhm.
very early, when I started writing about people in my family who were not Michelangelo or Edna St. Vincent Millay, I thought, I've got to keep it interesting.
Okay. Let's go back a few steps, okay?
Right?
If you would, to the decision after your father died to write this book and to tell the family secret, and kind of like what kinds of I don't know, negotiations did you do with yourself, or I mean,
None.
did you hesitate? You didn't hesitate to
No,
okay, all right.
because
And
I had a whole series of conversations with him on the subject, A, and
mhm,
B, I had an extensive period of my life in which I had relationships with women.
mhm,
So I felt that entitled me to speak on this subject. And
okay.
in fact, it that is part of the kind of struggle he and I have over the fact that he won't talk to me about it. And in a certain way, the bishop's daughter is the conversation he never would allow to have happen.
Okay.
Um,
And I mean, I think it's if for people who haven't read the book, some of the most interesting parts of the book are when you go to therapy with your father, when you have these incredible conversations and then they get cut off toward the end of his life, and you never resolved them. And so,
But then we resolve it
yeah,
different ways in
on the
the,
page.
yeah. Well,
But-
also, we had an extraordinary encounter before his death.
Okay. So there are a lot of people in the audience, or there are a number who are writing memoir. And if they were to say, well, do I have to wait for my parents to die to write about them? Like, what would you say?
I would say you don't have, well, I would say two things. I would say you don't have to wait until they die to write about them. You may have to wait until they die to publish what you write about them. And I might also say, I mean, with my father, I didn't know what the story was until he died. I didn't know what my story was. So I had tried several times to write the book earlier, but I was too angry and I didn't understand anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I only understood it when the story ended. The story of our relationship ended, I mean, or at least one phase of our relationship ended when he died.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say to people to write, I call it writing the hot spots or the chunks, you know, to just write those parts that are intense and, you know, file them in a way that you can find them. You know, the part about the lunch at the restaurant in Santa Monica, you know, 2006, you know, so, you know, when we talked about baseball, you know, just so you know what the chunk is, and then you have it. And actually it's from those chunks that a book evolves, that a narrative takes place, that you start to understand what the story is. Because as you know, Vivian Gornick talks about this in her book, The Situation in the Story. So I have a gay father who's a bishop, secretly gay father who's a bishop. And yeah, and so what else is new? You know, that's the situation, but what's the story?
Okay. And so the story, and what, like, how do you quote find the story? Or how do you discover it, or create it?
You start writing the hot spots. And in my case, what I realized pretty at a certain point into it was that it was a love story that, you know, when I was a little girl, we had a very poignant, lovely relationship. Which we did until their marriage started to fall apart. And certainly after she died and he married my wicked stepmother, it became very difficult. And then at the end of his life, I started to feel the return of this love, and I was just furious. It was like, no, I don't feel this way, you know. But then I sort of surrendered to it, and I realized that a story had been happening that I didn't understand, and that now, you know, I had the story, which was a kind of love story.
Okay, so let's talk. You've kind of touched a little bit on this, but let's see if you want to be more specific about this idea of the narrator, the writer as a narrator, the writer as writer. When you write a memoir, it's not a transcript of your life. It's not your diary. So it's not just, you know, dear diary, I went swimming today, I feel terrible.
Why don't you let me?
I want you to talk. Well, I just want
to read this little section of our revolution, because it's really about the process of writing this book.
Okay, great.
I went to quite a lot of writers' residencies while writing this book, because I teach, and I'd go to these residencies in the dead of winter. And one of them was Ragdale, which is in Lake Forest, Illinois, and it was snowy and cold. I'm 9 days into 3 weeks at a writer's residency where I'm working on this book, and I'm finding myself inarticulate on the page and frustrated. That afternoon, I have a cup of tea with another writer. She is working very well, she tells me. This is her first book and her first residency, her first time free of her full-time job and 2 teenage children. I can't believe how deep I'm able to go, she tells me. What innocence, as it was for my mother in the neighbor's guest room. Her solitude itself is a victory. In letters and her diary, my mother didn't reveal much. I am working on the book, she wrote to me. Where's her advice? I am, as usual, trying to wrest conversation from what my mother left behind. I remember the striking phrase in the diary she kept on the trip we took to Europe when I was 14. Tried to cross terrifying, slippery places. I'll take the liberty of turning it into a question. What made it so terrifying for you to cross into the slippery places of self-revelation? My mother isn't here to answer. Some months later, I took a day to sort again through the photocopied legal-sized pages of her miscellaneous writing. I'd been over and over them for years, but now suddenly at the top of the page, there appeared a sentence I'd never read. I was almost always we, and now I'm I. The page had no date, but I'll assume the issue of I first came up when she began writing her book. Using the first person singular is a decision of language, but also a decision about who occupies the center of a story. My mother would dedicate the people on 2nd Street to her children, naming and characterizing each of us. But the first words of the dedication are to Paul, my father, who has led a life worth writing about. Even when I read the phrase in 1968, without consciousness of feminism, it made me cringe. Hadn't she led an individual life? Now I decided to look again at the book itself, her book. For my husband, Paul, and myself, it was moving day, she wrote. But she soon settled into a first-person plural that does not distinguish her from Paul and the 2 other priests. We were on our way to downtown Jersey City and the Episcopal rectory we would all share. My mother's I first turns up in jokes about her gender. Who is the pregnant woman walking the streets with 3 young priests? To their New Jersey City neighbors, the black suits and round white collars rendered the 3 men indistinguishable from celibate Roman Catholic clergy. Who then was the young, very pregnant woman? Their shared mistress, a housekeeper? Since Episcopal priests marry, she might also be a wife. But who is she really? Just a few pages later, when I am about to conclude that Jenny's I, then describing the kitchen wallpaper, will let on nothing about her inner life, I find this, which I now read in a new way. I was in that cast a glazed eye at the world mood of late pregnancy, when internal focus suffuses any purposeful action with a female vagueness. She's just 2 weeks from the birth of her 4th child, my sister Rosemary, in a Jersey City hospital. Suddenly I have it. Pregnant, she is emphatically herself, and I, and she's revealed something else, that during years of childbearing, pregnancy had given her a habit of internal focus that engaged and preoccupied her. The feeling was physical as her riding horses in childhood, performing arabesques on a moving bicycle, or studying to the point of exhaustion at Barnard. Whatever else it became, the process of writing a book would also bring internal focus, like the preoccupation she loved and relied on while being pregnant. I'll say that her imagination recognized the metaphor and grabbed for it. When my father earnestly suggested that for her inspiration was a matter of being impregnated, she didn't protest. She wants Jersey City back. So she remembers and conjures it, and you feel her characters quicken. Harry comes alive on the page, the Polish sea captain next door, and Catherine Skipper, Ralphie Walker, the kids, and Father Myers again rips the keep out sign from the wrought iron fence and paints the lich gate red. Pregnancy had been a realm of privacy, which writing now returned to her. I'm working hard on the book, she wrote in her diary. I remember something my sister Marion, mother of 3, once said about our mother during those years. I think of her as being distracted. Not the jittery distraction of nerves, I'm thinking, but a gazing off into the middle distance distraction, the suffusion of simultaneous realities into the very individual life of a daydreaming writer.
Wow. So, one thing that comes to mind, many things come to mind as I hear this, but one thing, and you've kind of mentioned this, but the idea that this book particularly is an investigation, right? And it's an investigation into who your mother was and trying to recreate her. And you've said that you felt a lot of distance from your mother at many times, and that once you wrote the book, you felt like you, quote, had her, right? Isn't that sort of like what you said?
Well,
some version of that?
I
And
describe it as distance. We were very engaged, but a lot of time we were fighting.
mhm,
And what happened was that late in her life, when I was already going to consciousness raising groups and in women's liberation, she began to discover feminism also.
mhm,
And we became feminists together. We would
Mhm.
talk about, Ingrid Benjus's The Combat in the Erogenous Zone. And then she and my father's marriage was beginning to disintegrate, and she confided in me things in her letters about an affair she was having. And apparently I wrote back, please be careful, don't be seen in public. We became women together.
mhm.
And that was the part of our relationship which was cut short.
Mhm.
And in fact, while I was thinking about writing the book, and sort of between her death and writing the book, my father really, he wasn't, in truth, he wasn't around for that. So he didn't believe me. He couldn't understand why I was mourning her so
Mm.
much. And
Mm.
so finding these letters, that I had always had, was just this tremendous relief. I'm not crazy. This is the true story. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I did have her. It's like I had her back. One of my
Mhm.
sisters said, I feel as, after reading the book, I feel as if I have my mother back. And I felt that too. I felt that I kind of hauled her back from, the underworld.
Yeah, and that's a very, I mean, I don't know whether you imagined that would happen as you wrote the book. But it's
I
very
hoped
powerful.
it would.
You hoped it would. Okay, so
I always think these, I always it's going to sound corny, but I always assume that I'm going to have some deeply magical experience writing these books. Once I had that with the first one and the second one, I was like ready for it. Although
okay.
I didn't, and I had sort of ideas about what it might be, but I didn't know. I knew some of the material I had, but I hadn't really gotten deep into it and into her. And something about putting the chronology together, putting the life together, did deepen the connection. It's probably
that
a
seems
way deeper connection than we ever would have had in her life had she lived. Who knows?
well. So that seems like a moment to open the conversation up, because you're talking about, they're your experience of writing. Other people are writing. I'm sure people have questions of all kinds for you. So.
So yeah, so let's do this. I've got the the cue right here. We'll just kind of jump into it, and what I'll do, for example, it looks like Irene is at the top of the list here. Irene, take it from there, ask your question, and we'll just kind of let the gift unwrap itself.
Irene?
She might be on
I can't hear you.
The classic case is she might be on mute.
You have to
Okay,
tell.
I'm Honor, I like your style of writing, and it's not all linear, and how you pull it all together. And trying to understand your father, deathbed. I haven't read the books. I want to, but I've read, reviews by different people. I was curious to know, with your father in pulling his life together, if you ever talked, you mentioned your mother's friends, but what about your father's friends or close acquaintances? They must have struggled with the same.
No, this was my story with my father, and I actually didn't speak to any of his friends.
Okay.
I mean, I had spoken to his friends about him while he was alive, and I had lots of stories about that, but it was not a biography. It was really a memoir informed by, I felt that I had to contextualize it, because otherwise people really don't understand, what the world is. So.
Okay.
Somebody just started sharing their screen. Honor, but can I just mention that you did interview a man that your father had been involved with?
Oh yes, one crucial interview.
Yeah. And so that was really
so interesting. That was, how did this go? I think that I was given a letter from him at the funeral.
Yeah.
And it had a phone number in it, or maybe some weeks later, maybe I went up to the cathedral and was given the letter. And I guess I left a message. It's in the book, and I was unpacking stuff from that I had inherited from my father, all these boxes, and the dust was, I had a migraine from the dust, and the phone rang, and it was this man whom I call Andrew Verver, who and that is a scene in the book, that phone call. And then we become friends, and we meet, and he shares his letters from my father, and
you learn a lot about you learn quite a bit about his relationship.
We did.
With that man. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. And, my father died at 83, and he was a very attractive man. And I know that he had more than one male lover. But my question to him had been, did you love any of them? And he had said, they were all nice people, which drove me mad because it was so undisclosing. So, but I felt that I just needed one story. That it wasn't my job to, wander all over the world finding my father's many adorers. Though I did meet some of them on the book tour.
Okay, so we'll jump over to the next question. I'll jump in, and after me it'll be Amit, then Carol, then Cynthia, and then we'll kind of grow from there. When you talked about when you had the first part of the two-part reading, you build up to a large, I'd say, emotional climax. And it really, that was something that really kind of would drive home a book, or at least a good chunk of a book. My question is, what was the process as a writer to get to that place? We only see the end effect. We only see what you've created that the publisher puts on a page and that we read and digest. But the process of getting from A to B, and A to B to C to the finalized emotional wallop of that page, of that reading, how did you get there?
Well, I wrote a draft.
Yeah.
And then I wrote it, and then I revised it. And then I revised it. And then I revised it. Then I revised it.
I see.
And what you have to do when you get a big draft of something is you sort of have to figure out what the story is. What is it about? What is the transaction in that passage, and what's going on? And you try in your endless revisions to make that clear. And also, I'm a drama, I think, oh my God, that is great. I'm going to really get, the reader hooked with that, we all do that. Hello.
Okay. Put you on the mute there. Next, we'll go with Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Honor, and thank you, Liz. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. When you spoke about emotional chronology, I was intrigued. It was almost as if, I was sort of touched by an electrical charge, but I'm not sure what you meant by an emotional chronology.
Well, I touched on it a little when I said that the story of the bishop's daughter is a love story with a, early happiness, middle horror, happy, poignant happiness at the end. But I was driven by emotional chronology. I mean, or with my mother, it was sort of, who is she? So it would be sort of having a conversation. You sort of write down a conversation that you have, and then you figure out what you were feeling then, and then what else you might associate with what you were feeling then. So the passage I read from the bishop's daughter has various elements of it. It has the blue and green room. It has my mother pounding the table, has all these parts that are from different times, but they all serve the emotion of the passage. Does that help?
I think he's back on mute. So
Oh.
with that, we'll go to Carol. Carol Talley, you're up. I'm
Yes.
sorry, Ahmed, you're up.
I simply wanted to say, yes, thank you. I thought I nodded, but thank you, yes.
Okay, great.
Carol Talley.
Well, it's actually Gordon. I'm on my wife's computer.
Okay.
I
Be
honor.
it Carol, be it Gordon.
Gordon's in the
you're
book.
all,
He has a slight walk on in our revolution.
It's a cameo, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
For me, knowing you, I've been struck with both books, but particularly for Our Revolution, of just how honest you are about yourself in that. Talk to me a little bit about that. I had written in the note I sent into Bob before you brought it up about your mother that it was terrifyingly honest sometimes. Tell me about if you think you took that all the way and what the struggle was to get there.
Well, I don't mean to sound corny or coy, but the point is to write the best book possible. And if you go halfway, it's no good, So I was always trying to go in as far as I could so that the story would reveal itself. Because my interest, I am not a memoirist. There's a difference between memoirs and memoir. Memoir is, it's not about telling what happened, it's about figuring out what happened. So I'm always trying to figure it out. And if I don't, if I don't get to the bottom of it, then I'm not going to figure it out. And what's the point of writing it? A little bit. That makes sense.
It does. It's good to know you better from it all too.
and thank you, Carol and Gordon. And we're up to Cynthia. Cynthia Jabs.
Hi. I love being here. And I have to tell you, Honor, your writing was so impactful for me. I grabbed the New Yorker that had the beginning of your book when I was on a cross-country flight and my family was blowing apart with secrets and premature deaths and all kinds of things. And it was wonderful company for me. You sort of answered some of my question already. I wanted to ask about how you keep your commitment to memoir as opposed to taking off and following some fiction, some what if. Are you tempted by what if you had known your father's secret earlier? What if your mom had confided in you? Are you ever tempted to follow those pathways? And I think you sort of answered this when you said you really just want the one story, and you want to figure it out.
Well, it's not that I want the one story. It's more that I started as a poet, and I continue to be a poet, and that's and poetry and nonfiction feel much more connected to me than nonfiction and fiction do, although there certainly are fiction writers who turn to memoir, like Philip Roth, who's in the headlines right now. But I might fictionalize if it's necessary to tell the story. For instance, in The White Blackbird, she gave up painting. She stopped painting, and she never did something like go to Paris for 6 months and work in a studio. And at a certain point writing the book, I was so frustrated by that I wrote a scene in which she's in Paris in a studio painting. And I put it in the book, and the editor and I were going through the book, and I said, Courtney, that never happened. Does that mean I have to cut it out of the book? And she said, no, just put I imagine in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And I did. And the interesting thing was that the impact of it was not less because of putting I imagine in it. And in fact, it added a layer to the story that I put, it revealed something about the narrator that I put I imagine in there. But so I might venture into there are all these things now blurring the edges between fiction and nonfiction, Knausgaard and, Edward Louis and, looking back, Marguerite Duras, Marie Scheck's, Annie Ernaux, there are a lot of French, they don't do memoir, they call it a novel, and then they're free to make stuff up. I always say to my students, if you're gonna make stuff up, just tell the reader you're doing it. And I tell the story I just told. I don't know, I don't imagine that I'm not interested in what you suggest I might be interested in, like, what if he had told the truth about, that doesn't interest me, but it might interest me to, if I couldn't get at something any other way in a book I was writing, I might, as I did, fictionalize.
Great.
Now we'll move on to Christine. Christine, you're up. Christine, then Eileen, then Kate, then Philip.
Hi there. So I'm kind of new here and I haven't actually read your book yet, but I was wondering, you had talked about doing endless revisions, and also that you, especially with your mother's book, that you had a lot of source materials with her letters. And I was just wondering, how do you know when to finish? Is there a point that you're doing all this research and you have, I feel like one person's life is so much content. How do you know when to wrap it up?
Well, my books usually end with death, so that's very helpful. Sometimes there's a little post, little epilogue-y thing. But when to stop working on it, that just becomes, it's a little arbitrary. It's a little like, you get to the end of writing it and then you revise it twice, and then I don't think I could, yes, I could read it again and change some more sentences, but I might shoot myself if I did that. So then I stop. And also there's a page number, I try to keep within, I always end up with many more pages than, I always end a draft with many more pages than, usually about 100 or so more pages than the book ends up being.
Okay, Eileen, you had a question? Eileen, we may have lost
A
Eileen.
couple of short anecdotes because they occurred
Sure.
to me as I was listening to people's questions, and honor your describing your process. I published a memoir in 2007 called The Glass Seed, which was essentially about my relationship with my mother seen through the lens of her decline with a dementia.
Mm.
And I ended up, speaking of revisions, working with an editor who basically took about 25% of it and said, this is the part I want to keep, and I want to write from this part.
Mm.
So 75% of my first draft went on the cutting room floor, and the 25% became, for lack of a better metaphor, the seed for the rest of it. And it was not a very long, it was very meditative, very poetic in style. It was not revelatory in the same way as yours, Honor, but it was a meditation. And anyway, I have found as a writer that some of the most valuable experiences I've had have been around letting go of a tremendous amount of material that sometimes you write your way to the best part.
Exactly.
And you have to have a tremendous amount of you have to have a good editor sometimes, and you also just have to have the willingness for your writer's ego to let go of something that you've grown quite attached to, you think is semi-brilliant sometimes. So I think that that's part of the revision process. And the other anecdote has to do with what you shared, Honor, about the death of the parent. My mother was still alive, although in the grips of dementia, for all of my editing and copy editing and everything else. And we got to production almost. We were almost ready for that final level. And my mother passed away.
Wow.
And the editor contacted me after a respectful couple of weeks. I know she could hardly wait to contact me. And she said, I need to know whether you want to change the ending. And my mom was a real, she really ran a lot of stuff. She was very self-directed and very focused personality type. And that was part of what the memoir looked at, was the impact of the parents' focus and determination on the child, right? In this case, on me. And I said to her, I think if my mother had wanted the ending to be different, she'd have died sooner. So, it was just one of those, but we did end up in the dedication page inserting her date of birth and death under her name, because I dedicated it to her. And that was a quiet way of saying, she died before publication. But it was, I thought, just a really interesting cosmic joke almost. And with memoir writing, all of these things have more import, don't you think, Honor? They kind of, the bell rings more in a more sonorous way, because it is your very personal story. So when these little things like publication dates and editing happen, they seem to have a greater, deeper resonance because of your, I don't know if you could comment on that.
Well, they're always each of these three books has been a sort of gigantic piece of work, and then a kind of magic afterward when it goes out into the world and you realize sort of what you've done.
Yeah.
I mean, in this case, it was really bizarre because my book was published on March 10th and lockdown started on March 12th. So I went into, my mother had 9 children and did a million other things. I went into Jenny Moore mode and thought, what can I do about this? And I set about changing the publication process. But, the virtual tour, and I was sort of the first virtual book tour. But each of them is, and then I'm sort of done with the person in a way. It's very odd. In a way, I'm done with that. I'm not done with the books, but I'm done with.
Yeah, there's a certain amount.
They seem to resolve the relationship.
There's a certain therapeutic value to them, I think, for sure.
I hate saying that writing is therapy. I prefer metabolism. It's more
Okay.
because art is art and therapy is therapy and literature is
True.
literature.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
And with that, we move on to Kate Pfeiffer.
Hey,
Honor,
hi.
hi. This has been really, really interesting. Honor, well, for both of you, I'm interested in, you've talked about your background writing for theater and whether you, while trying to reconjure these conversations you had with your parents or whoever you're writing about, if you sort of brought them back and acted things out, like conjured them, and how much the theatrical background, and if you sort of role played at all while writing your parents, sort of try to recreate any conversations, how you really dig into that, and if your theater.
Not really, but I did things like in one of my residencies, and I was at the MacDowell Colony. There was an artist there named Lisa Auerbach, who's actually a Los Angeles artist, and two artists, and Julia Jaquette, who is a New York artist, and they were, and MacDowell had just purchased all these IKEA, those white cups, that muggy coffee cups that IKEA does, and they had a whole new set of cups. And while I was there quite a long time. That I was like there for, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks, and I would sort of speak my mother's sayings. You know, she would say things like, "You are on the ragged edge," you know, to one of my little siblings who had done whatever they'd done, or she'd say, let's see, what's another one? She'd say, "It's just one more thing." You know, I'll say, I'm going to do X and Y. And she says, "It's just one more thing." And there were tons of those. And it was Lisa's gift that she remembered every single one of them. And toward the end of the residency, she and Julia Jaquette took like 25 of these cups. I think they asked in the office, and they put the sayings, my mother's sayings, on these cups, and, you know, and put them back in the ceramic, you know, oven or whatever it is. So, and the people at MacDowell said, you know, it's fine that you did this, but I know they're going to disappear in a minute, you know. And the next time I came, you know, a year later, it was like they were all gone except for one. So some of my mother's sayings are all over the place. And but no, I didn't mean theatrical in that way exactly, because I never was an actor. I was more a producer kind of person and a critic thinker about theater. So it was more like, and reader and goer to a million plays. So it was more like that. But I always would walk around, you know, imitating her. And I and my 8 brothers and sisters do that too, you know. It now all happens on a WhatsApp siblings page.
Okay, so we go to the next one, which is Philip Ross, which I will actually read because he is juggling 2 young kids in the background at the moment, but following
Hi,
along.
Philip.
He may not, he's probably still on mute. And here's the question. First of all, he says, "Hello to my favorite writing teacher. There are such incredible uses of memory in both The Bishop's Daughter and Our Revolution. Post-publication, have you any subsequent memories of your parents bubbled up that you might be kicking yourself over not remembering or not using in the memoir?"
You know, there are, but I can't remember them. I know there, you know, and someone said, "Well, what, such and such," and I'd say, "Oh my God, I forgot to put that in." So there are things. I don't think they're things that would change the route of the story, you know, the trajectory of the story, but there are little, I just can't remember them just now. But yes, and I think that's true of any book. You're so kind of hooked into where you're going that you just don't necessarily remember everything. You remember what seems to be useful at the time.
I'll ask the next question. Let's talk about there's the writing process, the publication process, and then there's the what comes next process. So you have family members reading it, you have friends reading it. How do you negotiate through those reactions and maintain a traditional or non-traditional family dynamic?
Well, it sort of depends on the book, you know. The Bishop's Daughter was quite controversial in the family, and that was difficult. It took about 9 years to clear the decks. And then, but in part that was because we all had difficulties with my father, you know, kind of love, hate, whatever. And with my mother, it was very different. Everybody got amnesia about whatever it was that they had been so furious about the Bishop's Daughter, because they had their mother back. And so I had a very different, you know, after 45 years, they had their mother back. So, and the other thing was that, my mother died without any grandchildren, and now she would have, I think there are 30 grandchildren. So and the older ones have been reading the book and writing to me, and that's been wonderful. And they've said things like, you know, I was always afraid to ask my mom about Jenny because she died so young, when my mom was so young, but now I'm so happy to have her in my life because, you know, I have so much in common with her, or whatever, you know, so that's been gratifying.
Okay, let's move on to Ladine, you're up. And then Irene would come after that.
Hi, that's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love the anecdotes of the mugs and the sayings on them. I have two questions. So first of all, you talked about, Honor, you talked about writing into the hotspot to kind of make meaning of the story, and also how through the process of writing, you made sense of your relationship with your father and also your mother as a young person. I wonder whether despite the process and the tremendous efforts you put into these two books, are there elements that you would have wanted to find out and did not manage to shed light on? And in other words, you know, if you had the chance to ask a question to your father or your mother today, what would you have wanted to know that you did not manage to find out?
Well, I with my father, I wouldn't have had much confidence that he would answer me. And that's a lot of what the book is about, that he wouldn't talk to me about the parts of his life I was interested in. I would have a lot of questions for my mother, although I do think, I mean, you know, ultimately people remain mysterious. You know, you can only get what you can get. And when I say, you know, revision, it's less, it's to try and get to the core of whatever the thing is. And there's the weird thing with my mother. Oh, she was that kind of person, you know, which I didn't think of, you know, when I was 27 and she died. I didn't think of what, you know, a nerd, you know, she was a beauty, but she was also like, she wore glasses and she wore gingham dresses and she studied all the time. She was like a wonk. And I thought, oh, she was that kind of, you know, I hadn't kind of put that together. So I don't know, I might have asked her kind of gossipy things. What was so-and-so really like, you know, and am I right that, you know, I might sort of check some of my theories against her. But that passage that I read when I came across that page that said, you know, the we, I page, I mean, that was like from the great beyond, because that would have been a question that I asked her, and there it was right in front of me, the answer to it.
And with that, we move on to Irene.
I know deadlines are always, you know, an impetus to write, but I'm just thinking about when you're not under deadlines. There are a lot of writers here, And I just want you to speak from your experience. Do you get writer's block where, you know, a month can go by that you can't write, or do you get in a mania where you can't stop writing? And do you stop while you're in the thick of it, or do you endure it to exhaustion till you empty that space?
I find that I can't do more than 4 hours a day of actual composing, and that, you know, and composing, revising, and that the first 2 hours are the best. And blocks, it's more, I realize they're more about, I can't figure out how to do the next thing. So I try and figure out what the next thing is, and once I figure out what the next thing is, like the passage I read about, you know, being at Ragdale in the cold and not knowing how to do the eye, and that perception about pregnancy, you know, just came sort of out of the misery of not knowing what to do next. So I try and just sit with it.
So you do a lot of thinking, more than 4 hours.
I guess so. I mean, I would,
pondering.
when it's going on, I don't think of it as thinking. I think of it as misery, but yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
And
It's
before we
just
go,
sitting with it.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
And before we go to the next question, Irene gets, actually Christine gets an A+ for reminding me that Ladine actually had a follow-up question. She did, and I skipped right over it. So I'm going to go back to Ladine and let her ask her follow-up question. And then we're going to skip forward back to Christine and then Sandra. So shame on me.
Yeah, I mean, I think Honor touched on that, but in case there is more to say on that, I would love to hear it. Do you have any advice for those of us who do not have parents, who have written books or who have journals that they've given to us, where the material we have at our disposal is limited, and yet we are trying to find, we are trying to write a family memoir? Do you have any advice on how to push the story forward?
Try and find as much material as you can. Talk to their friends. You know, talk to their friends, talk to your siblings, talk to the cousins, talk to people you don't think would have anything to say, because even if someone has a dreary little snippet to say, it could end up being hook up with something else that someone else told you and make a lot of sense. So whatever resources you have at your disposal, go after, even if you don't think they're going to be interesting.
And with that, Christine has told us that she will pass the ball to Sandra Barkin. And Sandra, you're up.
Okay, I'm always interested in memoirs, and you have emphasized, as you've spoken with us today, the importance of truth to you, of telling us what really happened. When you write, do you have an audience in mind, or when you go back and edit the text, do you have an audience in mind?
I have a reader in mind, but not a particular person. Usually I have a sort of group of friends, or, you know, one or two friends who might be like Carol Gilligan, the feminist philosopher, and I became friends right at the beginning of my writing this book. And I had already started to think about my mother, who was like a tomboy athlete, kind of maniac, horseback rider, prize winner, you know, by the age of 10, in terms of Carol Gilligan's girls' work, where she talks about how girls have this power and then they sort of cop out at puberty when they have to enter patriarchal, you know, life. So I had the pleasure of getting to know her. So she was someone I talked to about it, and I had close friends that I would talk to about it and read to. But an audience, qua audience, no, it's sort of like I write the way I write at this point, you know. And I try to be clear. I mean, I try to have it make sense. And of course, my editor, Jill Bylowski, whom I'm very withholding with. I mean, she didn't get to read any of it until the entire book was done. Fortunately, she loved it. But, what if she hadn't?
Okay, let's see who's next here. We don't have, let's do this. Honor, walk me through a memoir, obviously other than your own, that you look toward as something of a North Star of how to craft a good memoir, one that tells the overarching story, captures the character, and really kind of pushes the reader forward. What jumps out at you?
Well, I teach a seminar in the master's program at the New School called The Uses of Memory.
Mm-hmm.
And I have many books on that list that are my North Stars: To the Lighthouse, the first 265 pages of In Search of Lost Time, which is the part about the childhood and the Madeleine and the tea and many other things. Marguerite Duras, The Lover, Joyce Johnson, Minor Characters. I have a lot of books, not all of them memoirs, that sort of take up that inspire me in different ways. I like the Joyce Johnson memoir very much because she happened to end up at the age of 19 becoming the girlfriend of this crazy writer named Jack Kerouac, who happened to publish On the Road while they were involved with each other. And so that book is both a coming of age memoir and also really one of the great portraits of a literary group in youth. But I just, I'm a, rag picker, a gem picker. I just get different, different ideas from different places. And I guess that, George Eliot, Daniel Deronda and Middlemarch, very helpful.
And the follow-up to that is sometimes memoirs make it to the screen, either in film, either a limited series, or a variety of different content platforms. At some point, does it lose the stuff of what makes it what? Somebody's gonna quickly, hold on, somebody's make sure we're all on mute here. Yeah, we're all back in mute. When something goes from the printed page to a visual format, do they lose too much of the nuance for that memoir to retain its special nature, or is it just, or does it become another story?
Well, it certainly becomes a different story, but I think whether it loses something or gains something depends on the gifts of the filmmaker. I mean, the filmmaker takes the material and works with it, and if the filmmaker is gifted, then you could get something amazing. The filmmaker is just like putting your thing on the screen, then of course it's going to be flat and boring.
Got it. Susan Rabins, you're up. She's unmuting herself. You're on mute, dear. Susan, you're still on mute.
Right there. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, as the eldest of 9 children myself, I wondered how you dealt with the mixed feelings, if you had any, from other sibs about your writing the memoir and putting it out into an audience that wasn't a family one.
Some of my siblings were quite disturbed by the bishop's daughter, and that was a very painful experience. And as I said, it took 9 years for it all to sort of shake out. You live through it. I have never regretted writing any of my books. It would have been awful if I had found that I actually regretted oh my God, I could have just not written it. No, that wasn't what I felt. I kept thinking of, all the writers who have, usually when I'm writing my poems and somebody rejects a poem, I think, remember Emily Dickinson. And when the Bishop's Daughter stuff started to happen, I thought, remember Salman Rushdie, because it was like a fatwa. So I actually wrote to him and I said, it's not the entire Arab world, but, it's been difficult. So it's hard, but it's part of it. It's part of, telling the truth as you know it.
And the next question is Elena Lim. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you.
Elena Lim, yes.
Hi, Honor.
Hi.
Thank you. My question is, you just talked about being a rag picker, and I'm wondering, how do you know when you found a gem in all of the things
They sparkle, and you want them. And you say, oh my God, I've got to put that in the book.
And
you just know it.
Okay. Thank you.
Elena is writing a wonderful memoir, and she does know what a gem is. She's just being sort of modest.
Yeah.
Well, we've had some. We're coming to the close. We're almost to 1:30, and I'm going to ask one person who hasn't perhaps asked a question. Is there somebody who wants to get the last piece of the pie? Well, I'll ask the last question. What's next?
I don't know yet. I have some ideas, but I'm not sharing them.
You'll save them for yet another Luncheon Society. Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Liz. I want to thank Honor. This was just really exciting. There are a number of people around the table who have written a memoir, a number who are writing a memoir, and it is. I think she's really painted a very, very accurate picture of not only how to do it right, but to do it in an impactful way, and to keep her writing true and honest. And I really am excited about that. Here's what's coming up. Now, a number of you folks have not been to the Luncheon Society. Believe it or not, before the pandemic, we met in a real restaurant and around a real table. We ate real food, hence lunch. And we actually had, depending upon where we are, we would have a pretty fun after party. But coming up in 2 weeks is our friend Lisa Napoli, who has written the book on the founding mothers of National Public Radio, titled Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki. And what will be fun is there'll be a number of their family members will be there too, which was really great. For example, when we did Sydney's book on the Mankiewicz brothers, we had a number of Mankiewiczes who joined us, which added an additional level of fun and cool to the conversation. After that, we're going to have our dear friend Sarah Tershwell. She's been with the Luncheon Society forever. She's running for the mayor of New York on the Republican side. And the irony, it only takes about 60 or 70,000 votes to pull that one off. And then after that, we have Alan Zweibel, who is just an amazing comedic writer. And we got a lot of stuff that is in process. And I'll be announcing soon, because I know the number of folks who haven't come. If you want to come, just ping me a quick email, say, gosh, golly, gee, this was fun. I want to do this more. We'd love to have you. So thank you very much. Thank you, Honor.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day. Be safe. Get your shots, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Bob.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.